Geoff, good afternoon.
Hi, how are you?
Good. Thank you, Porter, for accepting my invitation for the Center for Economic Diplomacy. We are honored today to interview you about the global risks in North Africa. It's concerning human trafficking, terrorism, and illicit trade. Before beginning, I want to precise that you are the president of NARCO, North Africa Risk Consulting in New York. So now I let you with my colleague and our member of Boston Club for the questions. Thank you again, Geoff.
Thank you, Anis.
Good afternoon, Dr. Porter. We are glad to have you here today.
Thank you.
So as a brief introduction, Dr. Geoff D. Porter is a president, founder, and managing director of the North Africa Risk Consulting, INC, a consulting firm specializing in political and security risk in North Africa. NARCO advises multinational corporations on the political and security context, mainly in Algeria, Libya, Mauritania, Morocco, and Tunisia. Dr. Porter was previously an assistant professor in the Department of Social Sciences at the United States Military Academy at West Point and a researcher at the Combating Terrorism Center from 2013 to 2016. His research focused on a conflict and instability in the extractive industries in North Africa and the Sahara. In 2017, you have contributed in the hearing before the Subcommittee on Counterterrorism and Intelligence of the Committee on Homeland Security House of Representatives on the 115th Congress First Session around terrorism in North Africa and examination of the threat. Dr. Porter speaks Arabic. He has an MA in Classical Arabic and PhD in Middle Eastern Studies. So you speak fluent Arabic and French, and over the course of your career, you have traveled and lived extensively throughout North Africa. As Forbes mentioned in one of its reports around human trafficking, it says that human trafficking is 150 billion a year global industry. So Sub-Saharan and North African region represent a significant part of this illegal business. In your opinion, Dr. Porter, what factors could mainly contribute to human trafficking?
Are you specifically asking about human trafficking from Sub-Saharan Africa through North Africa and into Southern Europe and Northern Europe?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And what factors could contribute in that?
Well, I mean, generally when you speak about migration, and human trafficking is an illegal subcategory of migration, you talk about push and pull factors, right? There are incentives for Sub-Saharan Africans to undertake a very difficult journey across the Sahel, across North Africa, across the Mediterranean and into Southern Europe. Those incentives include better work opportunities, better educational opportunities, better healthcare opportunities, better housing opportunities, and in general, likely a better life for them and their children. In addition, there are the negative push incentives or push factors emerging from Sub-Saharan Africa itself, where you basically have the mirror image of what is taking place in Europe. You have a very uneven playing field, which contributes to the dominance of an economic, social, and political elite, and the marginalization of the majority of the Sub-Saharan African populations from their country's economic lives, their country's political lives, educational lives, etc. So corruption is a major factor in determining a poor circumstances for Sub-Saharan Africans, and they seek better opportunities in Europe. In addition, you have human security issues, lack of food, lack of education, lack of healthcare, lack of housing, the preponderance of criminality and or political violence. And so there's a host of factors that are incentivizing or pushing Sub-Saharan Africans to seek a better life in Europe. And then there are a host of factors in Europe that are attractive to Sub-Saharan Africans that draw them or pull them towards Europe. The combination of the push and pull, I think, is so powerful that, as you mentioned, many sub-Saharan Africans are willing to risk life and death crossing the Sahel, crossing North Africa, which also can be an inhospitable environment, and then even crossing the Mediterranean in boats. And we've seen that, you know, throughout the summer months, but even into winter months as well. Human trafficking is a subset of migration, where you have criminal organizations that exploit those push and pull incentives or push and pull factors, and traffic in people from sub-Saharan Africa to North Africa, and then on to across the Mediterranean to Europe.
Thank you for this. Considering illicit businesses such as drugs, counterfeits, illicit arms trafficking, cigarettes, cargo theft, stolen oil, could you translate this, the aforementioned businesses into numbers in sub-Saharan and North African regions? And also, based on your data, what are the most illicit businesses that could be held or are held in Libya, Niger, Chad, and Mali?
Well, I don't have specific statistics for those different criminal activities that you mentioned. You know, I would also include in those the activities that you mentioned, trafficking in endangered species, illegal fishing, poaching of wildlife. And more often than not, what you will find is that the same types of organizations that are involved in drug smuggling, contraband, human trafficking, are also involved in illegal fishing or in poaching of wildlife or trafficking in endangered species. More often than not, these are all this overlapping or interlocking criminal enterprises that exploit the same kinds of networks, and they exploit the same kinds of channels to transit their illegal merchandise either north to Europe or south into the Sahara or sub-Saharan Africa. In regard to the activities that are most prominent in Niger and Libya, Libya is a chaotic environment in which a range of illegal activities take place, often under the protection of militias that are loosely allied with the Libyan state itself. So it becomes very difficult to police them. Effectively, the policemen are the criminals, and they're unwilling to police themselves. So you do have human trafficking. I think the human trafficking tragedy reached its peak in the 2018-2019 timeframe, where you actually had slave markets in Libya, where trafficked individuals were being sold from one trafficking organization to another trafficking organization. In addition, even during the Gaddafi era and in the 2012 timeframe, the 2014 timeframe, if you walked through the markets of Tripoli, or if you walked through the markets of Benghazi, you would find endangered wildlife. You would find trafficked gems. You would find trafficked gold. You could find any kind of drug that you wanted, whether that was an illegal drug like cocaine or hashish, or a prescription drug that had expired in Europe and was now being sold in Libya as a viable medical treatment. So the criminal environment in Libya represents the full spectrum of illegal activities, from poaching to drug smuggling to human trafficking. Niger is more limited, although you do have a propensity of human trafficking in Niger, where traffickers transit their human cargo from Niger into Libya and then from Libya onto Europe. You also have the preponderance of illegal pharmaceuticals that are now appearing in Niger in quite significant numbers, as well as there was recently a discovery by the Nigerian police of an enormous cache of probably Moroccan keef, Moroccan hashish, It was identified as Lebanese hashish, but Lebanon is not a significant producer of hashish in comparison to Morocco. In more likelihood, it was Moroccan hashish rather than Lebanese hashish. So again, Niger is not as lawless, and is the criminal environment is not as rampant in Niger as it is in Libya, but you still do have significant touch points regarding human trafficking and drug smuggling.
Dr. Porter, does this make, let's say, Libya a fertile ground for terrorists or terrorist attacks and risks?
Yes and no. Terrorist organizations do benefit financially from criminal activities. We know this. A classic example of this was Muqtar bil-Muqtar, who is now dead. Muqtar bil-Muqtar initially raised money for the organization that he was part of at the time, the GSPC, by selling contraband cigarettes, Marlboros. And we also know that the Islamic State had profited from the sale of Trafic's fuels, whether it was gasoline or diesel, and the Islamic State also profited from human trafficking. So, there is a relationship between terrorist organizations and criminal activity. That criminal activity does provide financial support for terrorist organizations, and it does allow them to undertake their primary goal, which is terrorism, which is to advance their political agenda. However, my argument has consistently been that the main drivers for terrorism are lack of rule of law, poor governance, and high levels of corruption. If you look at what terrorists want, more often than not, whether you believe them or not, more often than not, what they want is to transform society in a way that they think is more just and more fair. So if you can address issues of governance, if you can address issues of justice, if you can address issues of corruption, if you can address issues of fairness, then I think you can go a long way towards combating terrorism. Now, coincidentally, a lot of those issues, good governance and justice, also go a long way towards combating criminal activity. So the two do work hand in hand, except I think the primary driver for terrorism is poor governance, corruption, and lack of justice. And criminal activity happens to overlap with those a lot.
Dr. Porter, again, last question in this topic. Given your familiarity and background in Algeria, we would like to know what type of illicit businesses have you found that could are prominent, let's say, in Algeria, from the examples that we have mentioned above?
Well, it's interesting because the amount of illicit businesses taking place in Algeria in comparison to the illicit activity taking place in Libya, Tunisia, Morocco, Mali, Niger, Chad is insignificant. There is a much greater and much more consistent security presence in Algeria, which allows it to limit activities like human trafficking, trafficking in endangered species, drug trafficking. You do have the occasional discovery of large caches of drugs that drug traffickers are trying to move through Algeria. You do have instances of illegal immigration through Algeria, but oftentimes those people are not being trafficked through Algeria. They're simply trying to pass through Algeria on their way to Europe. And you also do have instances of cocaine sales, hashish sales, the sales of illegal or expired pharmaceuticals. But in comparison to its neighbors, Algeria's numbers are really, really low. And I think one reason for that is that Algeria does spend a significant portion of its annual budget on its defense sector, and that defense sector is dedicated to protecting Algeria's borders. It polices Algeria's borders much more rigorously than, for example, Libya's own security services do. And in addition, you have a large percentage of the budget that goes to the gendarmerie in Algeria. And so they police the domestic environment very rigorously as well. So you do have criminality in Algeria. I think every society has criminality, but it's interesting that Algeria's levels of criminality and transnational criminal activity are much less than those same activities among Algeria's neighbors.
Dr. Porter, due to the institutional fragility of countries in the Sahel region, a joint force was formed to combat the threat of terrorism and organized crime, which is the G5. How must this force operate as a priority to achieve its objectives? And given also the fact that Libya represents a great security challenge, mainly for Algeria and Egypt, what is the best solution, according to you, to find an accord between the government of Benghazi and Tripoli?
Well, in regard to the G5, the G5 is in a difficult situation. It has a very big mandate. What the G5 is supposed to do, ultimately, what the G5 is supposed to do is so far beyond what the G5's current capabilities are. So there's been a series of plans and proposals to increase the capacity of the G5 member states in order to allow them to eventually take on the responsibilities that they were charged with at the very beginning of the creation of the organization. The problem is, well, there are multiple problems, but one of the problems is that the money that was committed to support these plans and proposals to increase the G5 member states' capacities hasn't been as forthcoming as was expected. So in effect, the G5 largely exists on paper. It has considerable military leadership. Each of the G5 member states has committed a number of officers to support the G5's initiatives and to support the G5's missions. But at the end of the day, the majority of work that the G5 is supposed to take on for itself is being undertaken by other foreign militaries in Mali and in neighboring Niger. So you have a host of European militaries as well as a US military presence in Mali and Niger that serve as a proxy or a replacement for what the G5 is ultimately supposed to do. If the money ever comes in its full commitment to the G5, then it's possible that the G5 can assume the responsibilities that were assigned to it at the very beginning. But until that happens, I think the G5 will always be standing behind a foreign military force that will be doing the bulk of the heavy lifting in order to establish security in northern Mali, and in southwestern Mali as well now. In regard to Libya, there has been a dedicated UN process, which recently culminated in the selection of a new government, the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum, the LPDF. However, it has since come to light publicly that the LPDF process was beset with corruption, that it suffered from the influence of financial actors and benefactors to different proxy political actors. And as a result, there are questions about the legitimacy of the new Government of National Unity, the GNU. What's also interesting is that members of the LPDF and members of the UN panel of experts that were participating on the sidelines of the LPDF, as well as members of the United Nations support mission to Libya, knew about the corruption problems inside the LPDF as far back as November. Now, because the LPDF was supposed to produce a government of national unity, and it was supposed to lead Libya out of its current civil war, it appears as if members of the UN, members of the UN panel of experts, as well as members of the LPDF itself, refused to deal with the questions of corruption within the process and simply drove that process through to its end, hoping that the process itself would serve as a validation of the new government rather than focusing on the problems that were part and parcel of the process. So we have a government of national unity. We have a new prime minister in Libya. That prime minister is said to have bought the votes within inside the LPDF that allowed him to win. And it looks like there is going to be there's a potential for renewed civil war. There's a potential for simply a repeat of the problems that impacted the government of national accord, the GNA that preceded the GNU, the government of national unity. And it looks like the LPDF has resulted in a process that is bankrupt, and that it will not be the solution that Libya needs to get it out of its current impasse. Now, Algeria has proposed a political process for Libya, but unfortunately, the Algerian proposal relies on bringing all stakeholders to the table, whether they are members of the GNA in Tripoli, or the House of Representatives in Tobruk, or even if they're non-state actors, but still powerful actors within the Libyan political landscape, whether or not they're members of the state. Unfortunately, the Algerian approach has been disregarded. A Moroccan approach, which was running parallel to the LPDF, that was initiated in Skhirat, that approach has seemed to have garnered more traction than the Algerian approach, but it hasn't produced any results either. So I think it may be time to maybe try to rally behind Algeria's approach to solving the political problems in Libya and see if they bear fruit. As they say in Arabic, mafia bes. I mean, what's the worst that can happen? Nothing else has succeeded.
I mean, thank you for the extended answer. One more question regarding the AFRICOM. So what are the actions of the United States through AFRICOM to bring back stability in Africa? Also, a question that we wanted to add was a brief opinion of yours regarding Libya. Is there a possibility that Libya will become a divided country, meaning like divided into two countries as happened in Sudan?
Let me answer the Libya one first,
okay.
And then we can talk about AFRICOM. To tell you the truth, I don't know. I think there is a desire to maintain Libya as a single state. The solution to the South Sudan conflict has not proved to be successful. As you know, once South Sudan became independent, it itself descended into a civil war. So it does not look like the South Sudan model is the correct one for Libya. If Libya were to be divided into two separate nation states, one of those nation states would be a hydrocarbon-rich country. It would effectively be the oil-producing section of Libya today, and the other would be probably a dependent state. And then that raises questions about the viability of one or both of those two future Libyan states. So I think there is a tremendous amount of desire in the international community to see Libya remain as a single nation state. And there's a lot of reluctance to go down the path of creating two new Libyas, a Tripolitania and a Cyrenaica. So I don't think that is the solution for now. And I don't think the country is heading in that direction. In regard to AFRICOM, AFRICOM celebrated its 10th anniversary in 2018, I believe. AFRICOM was supposed to be a different kind of combatant command. There are several different combatant commands in the United States military. You have Central Command, you have the Pacific Command, you have Southern Command, Northern Command, European Command. An AFRICOM, Africa Command, was supposed to be different than those others. Africa Command was supposed to be based on what was at the time called the 3 Ds. It was supposed to be based on defense, diplomacy, and development. And the idea was that you would create a combatant command that would draw upon these 3 different domains to create a more lasting relationship with its partner countries and to create better outcomes with its partner countries that would secure the United States national interest. First, you would obviously have defense, which is what a military command should do. But then there was also diplomacy, the more conventional State Department role. And there is an AFRICOM ambassador based in Stuttgart. And then there was supposed to be development, which is more of a USAID type role, where the US Africa Command would help with infrastructure projects, educational projects, human security projects, things of that nature. However, what ultimately happened, though, was that the US military, being the US military, the other 2 Ds, diplomacy and development, were neglected in favor of defense. I mean, which is an understandable outcome, right? I mean, if you're talking about a military, what does a military do? The military does defense. It's not natural for a military to do diplomacy and development. So AFRICOM ultimately resembled the other combatant commands, EUCOM, CENTCOM, PACCOM, etc. AFRICOM has had some successes, and it has, fallen short in other areas. I think AFRICOM was successful in participating in the NATO campaign to stop Gaddafi from massacring his own people and ultimately leading to the removal of the Gaddafi regime. I think AFRICOM has been successful in partnering with Mali, Niger, Chad, Nigeria, Burkina Faso in combating terrorist activity in the Sahel. We know that Africa Command has participated in the elimination of some high-value targets among terrorist organizations in the Sahel, including Abdel Malik Druktal, the head of Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. And so there have been some successes, but there have also been failures where AFRICOM has not lived up to its initial mission of establishing an enduring partnership with African countries and leading to a greater human security and less political instability throughout the continent. I think one of the problems that AFRICOM has faced over the course of its existence is just the sheer size of Africa itself. I mean, there are 53 countries in the African Union. Africa Command, if you compare it to other combatant commands, is just dealing with a lot more nation states than other combatant commands. And it doesn't have the capacity to do that. It needs more resources, it needs more personnel, it needs more mobility. So I would say, the reviews are mixed. It's had some successes, but there are other areas where I think it can continue to make improvements.
Dr. Porter, in less than 1 minute, could you please tell us how can Algeria cooperate with different actors to resolve conflicts in these regions?
That's a terrific question. One of Algeria's problems is that it has been successful in combating terrorism within its own borders, right? I mean, if you think back to 2002 or 2003, you would be reluctant to leave Algiers. You would be reluctant to go to Sharaga after dark, right? I mean, and you wouldn't even think of traveling to Tigzert or to Tizi Ouzou, Béjaïa. You just wouldn't go. So over the course of the last 19 years, you can pretty much do whatever you want. You can, if you want to drive to Constantine and drive back and return to Algiers at 1 a.m. in the middle of the night, you can. If you want to go to, I don't know, to Paza, you can. And so one of the problems that Algeria has had, though, is that it has been somewhat successful in combating, well, very successful in combating terrorism within its own borders. The problem is that because it has been successful, Algeria doesn't listen to anybody anymore. Algeria, it will meet with the United States. It will meet with the French. It will meet with NATO member states, but it doesn't really listen. And I think Algeria thinks that it has learned all the lessons it needs to know. But the battlefield is always changing. The technology is always changing, and the nature of the engagement with violent non-state actors is also always changing. We have new technology threats that I think Algeria is unaware of. We have new technologically inspired weapons that I think Algeria is poorly positioned to combat. And so one of the things that Algeria could do better is to be more receptive to exchanges with its partners. Not just participate in exchanges, but sit down at the table and listen to what its partners can possibly tell it about new technologies or the emergence of new threats. And that would be my number one recommendation.
Dr. Porter, it was a pleasure having you here today with us at the Algerian Center for Economic Diplomacy. Thank you so much for having this interview with us, and we hope to meet you in person.
Inshallah. Inshallah.
Inshallah.
After COVID. Inshallah.